This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research at the Institute of International and European Affairs. A very warm welcome to this webinar at this unusual time at 4 o'clock on a rainy afternoon in Dublin, where I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mark Paul, who is the London correspondent for the Irish Times. And Mark is going to tell us a little bit about Labour's transition from opposition to government by way of a UK politics end-of-year review. Obviously, throughout the year, we pay real interest at the Institute to the politics of our nearest neighbour. And it's always a nice thing towards the end of the year to try and reflect on what might have happened over the span of the year. And it has been a very exciting one. I'm not going to spoil any of it for you, but I'm sure Mark is going to tell us about the recent election and the various kind of implications of that, Labour back in government for the first time since 2010. I'm going to very briefly introduce our speaker, take off the typical caveats, the typical bits of housekeeping, and then start a discussion with Mark, whose family name is Paul. Mark Paul has been the London correspondent and writer of the weekly London Letter for the Irish Times since January 2023. Before that, Mark was the author of the Backpage Caveat column in the Irish Times and also the Business Affairs correspondent. Mark joined the newspaper in 2013 from the Sunday Times, where he worked for almost a decade. Mark is currently a member of the Westminster press lobby, you lucky thing, primarily observing the political intrigue in the Houses of Parliament. But Mark also reports on events from Holyrood and the Senate in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and by the sounds of it, from all up and down the length and breadth of Britain. Typically, as always, the discussion today is on the record. You can participate as ever by putting a question in through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I encourage you to do so. And as ever, if you feel so moved, you can participate in the discussion using the X Twitter handle at IIEA. So, going to hand over to you now, Mark. And of course, in a moment, if you wouldn't mind addressing the topic of the discussion, Labour's transition from opposition to government. But before that, like we were just discussing earlier on today, I'm interested just to hear what it is like, as you've recently enough arrived in London, what the transition has been like, and what is it like journalising in London for you?
Yeah, it's a lot different from the job that I was doing in Dublin, Barry. I mean, I'm a member of the Westminster press lobby. I wasn't a member of Leinster House. I didn't report on it all. I was more focused on economics and finance before I come over to London. But when I come over first, you have to apply to join the Westminster press lobby. Of course, there's about 300 or 400 members of that, the accredited members who cover Parliament. And it's a long and torturous process to get the pass. And everybody talks about their pass like this mythical, spiritual document that allows you into the back halls and the corridors of power in Westminster. It took about 4 or 5 months to get that. A very, very heavy security process. And then once you get in, you really have amazing access in Westminster to the politicians. I mean, you could be walking along a corridor and there's Keir Starmer and, I was about to say there's Boris Johnson, but of course he had his pass taken away from him after Partygate. And that was one of the punishments that was levied upon him by Sue Gray. So working day to day as a lobby journalist in Westminster, there are two lobby briefings per day that you can attend. One is in number 9 Downing Street, and usually at about 11:30 in the morning. And then there's another one in the afternoon, I think it's at about 3:45. Or you can tune into those remotely. Sometimes I go to these lobby briefings, sometimes I don't, because I think being an Irish journalist in London, you're trying to do things, you're trying not to chase the same little bit of silver paper on the wind that all of the other lobby journalists in Britain are chasing. You're trying to look at things from a slightly different perspective, and you're over here more trying to analyze and explain than you are trying to break hard news. So look, I spend a lot of my time talking to MPs and going to events in Westminster, but I have what I call a 50-50 rule, I call it. I spend 50% of my time in or around Westminster, and then I spend the other 50% outside of that. And of that 50%, I'll spend 50% of that in London doing other stuff outside of politics, and 50% outside of London, up and down the country doing other stuff. So that's a kind of a little bit of a flavour of my life as a journalist here in London and in Westminster.
Very interesting, Mark. And I think a lot of people, I'd include myself in this when I lived in England for a long time, and you can trick yourself into thinking that you know England if you know London and maybe one or two of the kind of the university towns that I would have known. And it was just through chance getting bits of work and maybe making a couple of friends from different places once you get out into the kind of the wilds of England or indeed other parts of Britain. It's a really very enjoyable thing, but also quite different to life in London. And I think that's expressed politically as well as in many other ways. But I commend your 50-50 rule. I think that's really cool. Just again, one more tiny thing before maybe if you want to talk about Labour's transition from
Yes.
opposition to government, but just what's the typical kind of relationship or atmosphere between the different correspondents and journalists in the Westminster group? Like, it's interesting what you say, you're all chasing the same bit of silver paper, but in the end you're basically analyzing rather than trying to break hard news. I've always kind of had that hunch, but it's good to have you confirm it. Is it
I,
competitive? Are people collaborative? What's the kind of vibe typically like?
it's co-opetition, I would say, is probably the thing. Like just to emphasize, most of the other lobby journalists, the British-based lobby journalists, they are trying to break news all of the time, and of course we do try and break news in the Irish Times in Britain, more so on Anglo-Irish affairs. When I say analyze and explain, it's more about I suppose we're trying to differentiate what we're offering an Irish reader as opposed to what they can already get in the Guardian and the Telegraph. But as for the journalists themselves in the lobby, I mean there are WhatsApp groups where people share transcripts. For example, all of the broadcast members of the lobby, whenever they do an interview with a minister, they will share in advance transcripts with all of the print journalists, because it helps to promote their own show. And there'll be embargoes put on those transcripts, and you'll pick lines out of it. And people are there is a lot of cooperation, and there's a lot of collegiality. If you need something in the lobby, another lobby journalist will give it to you, whether it's a phone number, but also. I think there's also a danger in that too sometimes, and it's one of the reasons why I have this 50-50 rule. I think if you're a foreign correspondent and you're based in London and you want to understand Britain as a whole, you can't just do Westminster politics because Westminster is a bubble inside London, which is another bubble. And as you already alluded to, there's a whole nation outside of that. And if you just stick too much to the lobby, I think it's like do they call it a murmuration of birds who all move in one
That's the
fell
word, a
swoop?
murmuration, when the birds move as one. Yeah.
A murmuration, and I think as a foreign correspondent, you need to try and stay out of that murmuration, the Westminster murmuration, because they'll all move as one, and you need to try and find a different angle and a different way of approaching things.
Really, really interesting. It's always, I mean, I'm indulging myself here, but I always love kind of asking people about their crafts. And when it's something I follow British and Westminster politics as avidly as many people on the call. So just to get kind of a little bit of an insider's view is really cool. But the reason why we're here and why people have joined and why people will listen back after is because it's been an exciting year politically around the world, right? 2024. Ireland booking the trend a little bit with the incumbents not been thrown from office last weekend, but that's a discussion for another day. There was an election in the UK in July and other political events, which saw, amongst other things, Labour going from opposition to power. Why don't you share your thoughts with us, Mark, about what happened there, what it might mean?
Yeah, look, I'll try and keep my presentation relatively brief and leave over time for questions. But look, I suppose we'll start at today maybe and work backwards. And it's a good day to have this discussion because the Labour government under Keir Starmer has had its I think its second reset since it entered office today. Um, Up in Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire today, Keir Starmer laid out what he's called his plan for change, his six milestones, which are effectively the six things that he wants to be judged on at the next election. And these are different. I suppose people might be confused. There's already been the five missions and the six first steps and the three foundations. I mean, they really like their listicles in this Labour government. But he set out. I think what Keir Starmer has done today effectively is to effectively fire the starting gun on the next general election campaign. And speaking to Labour people this week, and that's definitely how they're seeing it. They've set out these kind of, and I made a note of them. I wasn't actually at Pinewood today. I had stuff to do around London this morning, but they've set out these six effectively targets, or they're a little bit like the sort of the five promises that Rishi Sunak made. And They're based around the first one is about making people feel better off and giving greater disposable income. The second one is to build 1.5 million homes in England. I made a note of them here. The third one is about ending hospital backlogs. Fourth one is 13,000 additional officers. And after that, it's about making kids school ready. And the last one was about clean power. I think what Keir Starmer is really trying to do is to hammer down metrics that he can be judged on at the next election. And I was at a briefing earlier on this week with Jonathan Ashworth, who, of course, should have been in Keir Starmer's cabinet, but he lost his seat in Leicester South in the election. And I was kind of asking him about this, about the the wisdom of setting metrics, because when you set metrics like that as a politician, of course, you can be hammered by the electorate when you don't reach them. I think most famously, Rishi Sunak's metric about stopping the boats, I think was one of the things that really stopped him winning re-election. If you set these targets that you could be hit on them. And Jonathan Ashworth's reply was quite interesting. He said that the British electorate has lost trust in politics, and one of the ways of restoring trust is by speaking about targets and metrics and allowing yourself to be measured against them. So that's basically what they've been doing. But I suppose going back to our overall reason for chatting today and looking at Labour's transition to power, the thing that has stuck out for me and that a lot of people that you speak to around Westminster talk about is that this Labour government seemed to have been much more prepared for the election than it was for government. And I think that's the first principle or the first thing to talk about. And I think that was a real that's I think one of Starmer's real flaws, one of the mistakes that he's made as a Labour leader. Um, I think it comes from what he described as his Ming Vase strategy, which is the strategy that he deployed before the election. And when if you can kind of imagine somebody carrying this precious Ming vase to Downing Street, which is where he wanted it to get there with it, he didn't want to drop it. He didn't want to take any risks. You don't juggle the vase. You don't try and do fancy tricks with it. You just try and walk as quickly and as carefully as you can to Downing Street carrying this vase. And as a result of that, he didn't want to take any risks, and that means he didn't want to say too much about what they do in government. So they employed Sue Gray, a former civil servant, and they, well before. I mean, she was in place, she was in place. March 2003, they appointed her. She took up her role in September 2003, and her role was to get Labour ready for government. I mean, even from the Liz Truss days in late 2022, they had basically 2 years to prepare for government when it was obvious that they were going in. And it seems like they weren't prepared at all going in, and that they made. I think a lot of people on this call might will already know Labour made quite a bad start in government. In the first week or so, I mean, they had a flurry of announcements. They announced the start of GB Energy. They announced new legislation to nationalise the railways. And they started the National Wealth Fund, and I think on day one they scrapped Rishi Sunak's Rwanda plan. But they seemed unprepared for government. The general thinking behind bringing Sue Gray in from Keir Starmer was that she would do the government stuff and Morgan McSweeney, an Irishman, would do the politics. And that didn't really work out for Starmer, and that all blew up in his face then by October when Sue Gray then was sacked. And Morgan McSweeney, a guy from Macroom in Cork, he's lived in London since he was 17, comes from a Fine Gael family, and he's in his mid-40s now, same age as me, comes from a Fine Gael family. I think his aunt is a Fine Gael councillor down in Macroom. I think one of his first cousins, I think, was a special advisor to Leo Varadkar. But he is now at the heart of the Downing Street operation. And since October, and it's really noticeable, you really notice this in the Westminster lobby, number 10 Downing Street is a much more political operation than it was before October. That's really, really noticeable. And I think the new Morgan McSweeney Downing Street is being run along three basic principles. Barry, the first one is that there is now a relentless focus, or there will be a relentless focus on making voters feel better off, the right kind of voters, not the voters who will never vote Labour, but the voters. They're insanely focused upon people who voted Conservative in 2019 then didn't feel well off and switched to Labour in the July election just gone, and they're terrified about losing those voters. The second bit is that Morgan McSweeney's always been a very data-driven guy. I mean, before he came into the Number 10 operation, he ran Labour Together, which is a kind of a pro-Keir Starmer think tank, and he had data on everything, and he masterminded Keir Starmer's rise to power, really. And then the third principle of the Morgan McSweeney Downing Street that is different to the Sue Gray Downing Street is a much better focus on communications and trying to get ahead of stuff. I mean, to give you one example of that, under Sue Gray, Downing Street basically allowed the Treasury and allowed Rachel Reeves to implement this policy about winter fuel payments and taking winter fuel payments away from pensioners. I think under a Morgan McSweeney Downing Street, that would never have been allowed to happen, because just to update people what happened, and they basically means test winter fuel payments now for British pensioners, and I think there was this idea that rich pensioners were getting it, but of course, in the minds of British voters, a rich pensioner is somebody who has an income of 100 grand, not somebody who has an income of 11 grand, which is the new threshold. And I think Morgan McSweeney understands better than Sue Gray that you need to communicate these kind of things better, and that there needs to be a focus on talking to the electorate in a way that isn't about deliverology. It's about having a narrative and a story. And a weakness of Keir Starmer that we saw through the election and until now is a kind of an inability, I think, to tell stories. And he lacks a little bit of emotional intelligence, Keir Starmer, I think, in some ways. Maybe that's a bit harsh. He lacks the ability of some of his predecessors like Tony Blair to tell a big story and a big narrative, and he might admit that himself. I mean, I've spent a bit of time with Tom Baldwin, who is a former Labour Director of Communications, but who wrote a very well received biography, a kind of a friendly biography of Keir Starmer, but a quite well received biography of him, and that was published at the beginning of the year. And he basically said that, Keir Starmer wakes up in the morning and wonders why he has to talk about his parents to the media, why they're interested in Arsenal, why they're interested in what his kids do and how his wife feels about moving into 10 Downing Street. He hasn't quite copped onto the fact that you need stories and narratives, and emotional intelligence to deal with the British electorate, and that you can't just focus on deliverology, which is delivering data and results and numbers and so on. Another thing to talk about with this government is that they are terrified, and this came from, this really stood out in this briefing I had with Jonathan Ashworth earlier in the week. They are terrified of being a one-term government. It's a real fear in this government. When you look at their election victory, and we can talk about the election, and maybe I'll leave that for questions. I'll take questions on the election itself. But when you talk about people in this government, they won over 400 seats with barely 35% of the vote. They actually got a lower share of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017. And this is really understood in Labour, that whilst they had this massive victory in seats, that it's quite brittle in a lot of ways, and that they're going to be hit from both sides. They've got, obviously, the threat from maybe the Conservatives might make some sort of a comeback. There's also the threat from Nigel Farage's Reform UK, who could cause them a lot of trouble in a lot of places, and then also the threat from their own left wing in the party. And there is a real fear that even though they got this massive majority, that they could effectively lose out, not by the Tories winning a majority again in 2029, but maybe by some sort of a Tory, maybe a coalition with Reform or something like that could overtake them. So they're hyper focused already on the next election. Another thing to talk about, I suppose, a real milestone this year for this Labour government, and again, I'm working slightly backwards here, is it's impossible to overestimate how totemic the budget at the end of October was for this government. How surprising it was, the approach that Rachel Reeves took, the shock almost, and how stunned people in Westminster were by the scale of the taxation changes and the tax and spend nature of the budget. I mean, I was sitting in the press gallery of the House of Commons when she announced some of the numbers around taxation and so on, and there were literal audible gasps of surprise at that budget. And what that budget did was it really laid down a marker. It was a real traditional social democratic budget. And it laid down a marker that this was how Labour was going to govern, that they were going to focus on working people and their standards of living. And I suppose, it was, I think, politicians talk about campaigning in poetry and governing in prose. I think Keir Starmer campaigned by being a friend to business, but once they've gotten into power, they've really focused on workers and on voters. And then I suppose really quickly, and I'll bring this to a conclusion now in a second. But another thing to talk about is their foreign affairs and their approach to foreign affairs. I suppose another thing that you pick up in the lobby is that there's a lot of irritation in Labour at the moment, or there has been until now, about the amount of time Keir Starmer has been spending abroad. And they think he's been spending too much time abroad. In fact, I think they cancelled a trip to New Zealand to try and pare back some of his foreign engagements. You can kind of understand why Keir Starmer was doing this. He was trying to reset Britain's damaged image abroad. I think he made a good fist of resetting the relationship with Ireland. I don't think Britain has made such a good fist of resetting the relationship with the EU, and that's something that we can talk about in the questions and the question and answer session, and with myself and yourself and with everybody on the call. So the foreign thing, I think you're going to see that scale back a little bit more. Another kind of insider's tip, I guess, is something that we've noticed over the last couple of weeks is that Morgan McSweeney has effectively fired all of Number 10's foreign policy advisors. And there are actually no official foreign policy advisors left in Number 10, as far as I know, unless they've appointed one in the last couple of days. They have, they're really running on empty there in foreign affairs, and that's because they want to focus on the foreign stuff. And I don't know, Barry, whether you want to talk myself and yourself about the election campaign now, or if you want me to give you a little vignette on that and how the election campaign itself went. But I spent most of the election campaign on the road. I think over the course of that 6-week campaign, it was a long campaign. I think I spent about 4 nights in my own bed here in London. I spent most of it running around the country. And the one thing that I picked up during that campaign is that, the needs and the wants of voters outside of London are entirely different to the needs and the wants of the voters inside of London. And particularly I found up in the northeast of England, and that's where I think Labour fears losing its majority. I think the Reform Party came second to Labour in about 72 constituencies, right? And most of those, or a lot of those, were in the northeast and the Midlands of England. And they're a Reform Party, and we can talk about this as well. They're going to be a real threat to Labour in the next election, not necessarily a threat to its position as a government, but certainly to the size of its majority. And so I noticed that in the election campaign that there was no real warmth. I didn't pick up for Labour in places like Sunderland, in Durham, in Hartlepool. They won back Hartlepool, but there was no glad tomorrow, no sense of glad tomorrow in these places in the same way that there was in 1997 for Tony Blair. So that's something that I think they're conscious of. Look, I'll wrap it up there in terms of my remarks. That's something that I was conscious of, that there was no real love for this Labour government. They know that. They're terrified about losing the next election, and they fired the starting gun on it already, I think.
Thanks a million, Mark. You covered an enormous amount of ground, loads of really interesting topics, a few of which I might pick apart with you, including, let's start in a moment by going back to the campaign and the canvas and what you kind of saw and experienced there, because I think I would certainly find it very interesting. But I'll just remind those of you who are online, of course, there's a few after coming in. But if you do have any questions for Mark, please do drop them in, and I get through as many of them as we can. So thank you for covering Morgan McSweeney. What a fascinating story. And I was aware of I'm aware of some of the impact he has had, but I didn't realize what you were saying about the foreign policy advisors. There's probably a few people on the call who might be interested now looking at Guardian jobs to see if there's an opening for them in Westminster, because I didn't realize that was a thing. So yeah, but also like something I'm really interested in as like intellectual or as academic as it is electoral systems and how they differ. And I've worked in both the Irish and British systems, as I said to you before, and just the frailties of the UK system is just so abundantly obvious. I think it's something like it was a 1.6% swing I think Labour got from the previous election, the 200 extra odd seats. The Tories lost 20% of their vote, but still, I mean, it's absolutely what you say about the kind of the fear of a one-term Labour government, I can totally get that because it's within the margin of error, basically, that you could easily have, if you have a bad election, Reform have a good election, you could really be goosed. And then also what you just said about what you were saying there about being out and about in different places.
Hmm.
When you were during the campaign, did you follow any canvases? Did you just kind of hang out in polling places, or how did you actually conduct yourself during the campaign? What did you go and see and watch?
I did do I followed some canvases before the election campaign. There was a lot of talk about how Scotland was going to be the key to a
Yeah, I
Labour
want to ask you about
majority.
that in a moment, actually. But yeah,
Yeah, but I mean, I spent quite a bit of time. So I spent quite a bit of time in the election campaign up in Scotland, particularly along the central belt, which runs from Edinburgh to Glasgow, which was where Labour was trying to win back all of these SNP seats. And we can talk about Scotland more, if you have other questions on it. But I spent a little bit of time on the canvas there, with a guy. God, his first name was Greg. I got his second name has gone out of my head, and he won anyway. He won a seat back in that central belt area. It was around Livingston. It was a seat for whoever is the MP for Livingston. If somebody
that
wants to
Greg
Google,
McClement. I literally just Googled it. Was it Greg McClement? No,
his first name is
MP
Def.
for
First name.
Cumbernauld. Anyway,
Yeah,
carry
yeah.
on.
So spent a bit of time with him, and Labour was getting not enormous warmth on the doors, but there was a certain dynamic up in Scotland where people are just sick of the SNP. And I mean, they've been in power up there for so long, since 2007, 17 years. You had all of the Nicola Sturgeon scandals and motorhomes and all of that. So people gave Labour a cautious welcome back in Scotland. I spent a bit of time in the northeast of England, and that was, for me, that was the most profound part of the election campaign. Because again, a lot of people who Irish people think they know Britain so well, right? And because maybe we follow a British football team, I follow Man United, and maybe they watch EastEnders, maybe we have some relatives here, you come over a couple of times a year, and you think you know Britain, but until you go to the depths of places like Sunderland, you don't really know England. At least I have to say, you see a level of poverty in those areas, obvious poverty and deprivation, that I think you would struggle to find its equal in Ireland. And that was something that really stood out for me during the election campaign. And so there was a cynicism, I thought, towards Labour up in the northeast of England, and maybe a bit of an aftertaste from the Brexit vote. A lot of these areas obviously had voted for Brexit, and a bit of suspicion around how Labour would treat Brexit. But I think in areas like the northeast of England and the south of Wales, where I spent a bit of time as well, this will be, I think, the battleground in future between Labour and Reform UK, and those are the two areas that Reform are targeting now. They are targeting the northeast of England and most of all South Wales, which is a phenomenon all of its own that I find very interesting that they're targeting South Wales. And I've spoken to Nigel Farage about this. I've had lunch with him. I've sat down with him a couple of times. And they're targeting South Wales because first of all, I think the demographics suit. You're in these kind of post-mining, deprived areas, very Brexity areas. But also because you've got a proportional representation system of voting in Wales, and there's voting for the Senate in 2026, and they think they can make inroads there. So sorry, I know you asked me about the campaign and did I get out and about on the canvas? And I did. I went to quite a few official events at the very start of the campaign and at the very end of the campaign. In the middle, I kind of went my own way. And you notice in these campaigns they're sort of organised to within an inch of your life. And Labour was highly drilled on these campaigns. I think again Morgan McSweeney was the guy who really ran in a lot of ways the campaign and planned for it. And they were really well drilled, and much better drilled than the Tories were. I mean, everybody remembers Rishi Sunak calling the election in the pouring rain, and not coming back for D-Day and so on. It was a very well run, very efficient, but I would say almost a slightly joyless Labour campaign in a way. It wasn't like 1997 at all. And I mean, I remember 1997 well. It was a year I did my leaving cert, so it stands out in a lot of ways. It was a year I really started to look at politics, and there was just no sense during the election campaign anywhere in Britain of this great welcome for Keir Starmer as an individual. And I'm not sure whether that's a weakness of his or whether it's something he'll make the best of. Tom Baldwin, in his biography, talks about how Keir Starmer's approach to politics, certainly when he was leader of the opposition, It was as if he was walking through a minefield. And if you can imagine somebody walking through a minefield, you don't just trudge across it with this great sense of direction and purpose. You might go take two steps forward, two steps to the side, one step back, skip over something, jump. It looks messy, it looks inelegant, but it's the best way of getting to the other side. And when he was leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer knew how to get to the other side. The other side was Downing Street. That's where he knew he needed to get. But once he got into government, I'm not sure he quite understands yet what the other side is. And that's what he spent time trying to get his head around. Where am I trying to go? I mean, he made a very bad start, Keir Starmer, as leader of the Labour Party when he was appointed in 2020, right up until deep into 2021 when they lost that Hartlepool by-election and he thought about quitting. And then he turned it around. And I think within the mass ranks of Labour MPs, and most of them new MPs, and they really do believe that Keir Starmer will turn it around, and that his dogged kind of technocratic problem solving, move the rocks out of my way over time approach, will bring Labour a new election victory, and we'll see that, you know. But the campaign itself was interesting, the glitz and the glamour, of course, in the organised events, but really what I noticed was the lack of love for Labour in the at the doorsteps, you know.
Really, really, really interesting. I wonder, just from again a quick Google, was it Gregor Poynton, the
It was Greg Poynton. That was it. A
MP for
bearded
Livingston?
guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Greg Poynton, who I believe used to work for Barack Obama once upon a time, or at least
Yeah.
that's what he told me. That's what he told me when we were walking for a firm that advised Barack Obama. I think more accurately, he told me that as we were walking around the doorsteps. But yeah, Greg Poynton. Yeah.
Congratulations on your election, Greg. The just have two or three thoughts to share, and then we can get into some more questions. And I'm really, really with you on what you said about kind of knowing England and Wales. I mean, it's self-evident in any
Mhm.
country, not just in England, but like once you get out of the main sentence of commerce or of politics, you really get to see a different side. I'm a fan of Shane Meadows, the filmmaker, and he depicts England in the 80s and 90s in a way that's really vivid, and Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire and these parts of the world. So it's really, I think it's really cool to have had that experience to go to the. Were you at any of the counts outside of London, or did you have to come back and write up your stuff, or did you get to go to a sports
Um,
hall
um,
in Essex or anything?
I, I didn't go to any of the count halls. What I did was I went to they call it the unofficial official watch party. They all have their watch parties
Mhm.
here for the election where they all stand around. And I went to one which is organised by a company called Lodestone Communications, which is a Labour focused PR company, I guess, communications company. Um, the official event watch party was in the Tate, and even most Labour staff couldn't get tickets for that. And for example, all of Angela Rayner's staff were sent to the one that I was at, and I observed that on election night. And you know, I think when you're writing about politics, and maybe when you're observing as an outsider, or maybe when you're writing about it academically or journalistically, you forget how involved these people are, how much of a part of their lives it is. And whereas for us, we're observing it almost from a neutral point of view. When 10 o'clock came and when that exit poll was about to drop, they dropped there was a big screen at this watch party that I was at, and I watched all of the Labour people. I watched Tom Watson, I watched Lord Southwark, Roy Kennedy, other people. They all moved apart from each other to watch it on their own. It was almost a spiritual moment for them, a personal moment where they wanted to watch this exit poll drop on their own and without talking to anybody else. And I understood then in that moment that, you know, politics is really personal for these people. It's really a part of their lives. And as a journalist, you know, as a kind of a scrappy outsider criticizing everybody, you don't sometimes realize how emotionally invested these people are. And after a couple of minutes, when they realized that they had won 400 and something seats, they all coalesced back in groups to chat about it. But just for that moment, they all separated, and I found that a very, very interesting moment to observe as an outsider, you know.
Sounds amazing, and it's the yeah. I mean, that's I've lived that. I'm totally kind of enthralled to what you're saying. But at the same time, I'm thinking of something from having. I'd be the first to say that British and Irish culture shares so many similarities, and also our political cultures. But having spent time in and around both, the the electoral system again, which we've already mentioned,
Hmm.
lends itself to such a different sort of elections because
Exactly.
when working in the UK, so much of the emphasis on polling day is about kind of getting your vote out or
Hmm.
knocking up, trying to get people who've committed to you to show up. Whereas in Ireland, you're still chasing the twos, the threes, and the fours. You know, you're ch chasing your transfers. So if someone isn't going to vote for you, you appeal for their second or third or fourth. And indeed, where the institute is, in Dublin Central. We saw that. We saw the magic of PRS TV playing out at the weekend, where Mary Sherlock overtook Jerry Hutch. Mary Sherlock elected in a four-seater alongside Mary Lou, Pascal Donoghue, and Gary Gannon. Like, the media types, you meant to list off everyone in a constituency, but you really saw like just the different political vibe. And then in the count centre, again, I've been in both count centres in the UK and in Ireland, like the tallying, the kind of sense of a truce you get in Dublin, in Ireland
Mm.
rather, when the elections are finished, that like it is a bit more, the winner takes all nature of UK politics just makes it a slightly different experience than in Ireland.
They do value that. I have to say, I've had a lot of conversations with people in Westminster about the different political systems that we have. I mean, they think ours is a bit too uncertain. Coalitions obviously over here. I mean, obviously you had the Lib Dem Conservative coalition from 2010 to 2015, but coalitions aren't the norm obviously over here. They like in their first past the post system the definite result, that it's a decisive move, that the country can take a decisive direction. But of course, it has all of these weird anomalies. Like, for example, if you look at Reform UK's vote versus the Lib Dems vote, right? Reform UK got more votes than the Liberal Democrats. Reform UK won 5 seats. The Liberal Democrats won 72. Now, that is an enormous difference, and you really have to question whether or not that is fair. But look, you have to play the game by the rules which are laid down, and everybody plays the game on the same rules. And maybe if Labour had been fighting an election under our system, maybe they would have won a higher share of the vote. Maybe they would have fought the campaign slightly differently. But under Morgan McSweeney in particular, there was this relentless focus on voters who matter, not just any old voter, but the voters who will vote Labour. Like, for example, again, you saw a hint of this in the last couple of weeks in the way Labour was prepared to jack up inheritance tax on farms, right? Labour has
Oh yeah.
made Labour has made a kind of a judgment that these kind of welly wearing, wax jacket wearing kind of toffs in their eyes to a lot of Labour people will never vote for them anyway. And that this whole inheritance tax loophole on farms was being used by big landowners and people who were really hobby farmers to stash their capital. And they don't mind taking the media hits on that. They don't mind the protests, the farmers and the wellies up in Parliament Square, because they think these people aren't going to vote for them anyway. And I think that's really a Morgan McSweeney driven approach. Morgan McSweeney is Keir Starmer's politics brain, and I think that's the best way of looking at it. Keir Starmer is a technocrat. He doesn't have the big emotionally intelligent Tony Blairite kind of approach. He also doesn't have really the knowledge of the Labour Party. I mean, he's only an MP since 2015. And Morgan McSweeney he's become so reliant on him, I think, that the two are almost indivisible at this stage.
Really interesting, Mark. I could keep chatting to you, and I'll have a chance to, I guess, put in a few more questions myself. But we're going to go to the Q&A in a moment. I want to ask you one more thing. It's a two-part question just before we dip into the audience questions. Just looking away from the Labour Party, new leadership in the Tory party under Kemi
Mm.
Badenoch.
Mm.
Hardly mentioned the Tories actually over the course of the past 35 minutes or so, which is interesting. And then you've also mentioned Reform. Do you have anything
Mm.
to say just about the performance specifically of those two parties? You can mention any of the others as well if you think there's anything interesting to say, but especially the Tories and Reform since the election, and anything of interest you'd like to share.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just maybe I probably already mentioned it already, but reform I think will be one to watch over the next couple of years, and there'll be one to watch in the Senate elections in Wales in 2026, where they're really targeting. Reform launched their campaign for the entire UK general election in July. They launched it actually in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, which was a signal of intent. And also, when you talk to people up in Scotland, under current polling. There'll be elections for Holyrood as well in May 2026. Reform are on track under current polling with no campaigning or anything to take about 8 or 9 seats in Scotland under the list system. So you've got this interesting phenomenon of this essentially an English nationalist party, which is on course to have quite a reasonable presence in Scotland and potentially a significant presence in Wales, Wales is effectively a one-party state, right? A Labour state. So Reform are one to watch there. Just in terms of Reform, obviously they've had their own problems. There's been a little bit of a power struggle inside Reform since Nigel Farage came back. I stood having a glass at the very start of the election campaign. I was at an event in London and I stood about 18 inches from Nigel Farage, looked him in the eye and asked him, "Are you going to run in the election?" And he looked me back in the eye and he swirled his glass of wine and he told me he wasn't. And 36 hours later, he jumped into the campaign. And since he came back into into Reform as leader, there's been a little bit. There's a guy called Ben Habib. I don't know if you know him, if you've come across him. But Ben Habib was the deputy leader of the Reform Party, but he had set up this alliance between the Reform Party and the TUV in Northern Ireland, which is Jim Allister's party. And Ben Habib was basically ousted when Nigel Farage came back, and Nigel Farage decided to back to endorse his DUP friend Sammy Wilson, who got back in, and Ian Paisley Jr., who didn't, and that caused a big rupture. So Reform has been trying to professionalise itself. I was at the Reform conference up in Birmingham in September, the annual conference, and it was noticeable how more professional it was than other reform events I had been at. Some of the reform events I was at during in the early summer, for example, before the election campaign was called, they're quite earthy, and they kind of got off on having this kind of grassroots approach, very informal, lots of cursing and swearing and swilling beer at these events, and but at the campaign in or at the conference in Birmingham, it was much different. Reform sees itself, I think, as a party that could win a very, very large amount of seats at the next election. And I think a lot of the dynamics are actually in their favour to do that. Obviously, they need probably proportional representation to be brought in Britain to have a chance really of getting into government, because I think it would be difficult to see the Tories doing a deal with them. You asked then about the Tories themselves. At the Tory conference in September, late September, start of October, which was in the Tory conference again was in Manchester, I think again, wasn't it? It was noticeable how there was a sense of relief, I think, about the Tory party. A little bit like people who knew their beating was coming, and once you take that beating, there's almost a relief rally at the end of it. You know that the worst has happened. I thought there was a lot of optimism in the Tory party, strangely enough, when I was at that conference at the start of October. The leadership contest at the time was underway, and it looked during that conference like James Cleverly was starting to eke into the lead. James Cleverly was the former Home Secretary, former Foreign Secretary as well. He was the one that Labour feared, if that's the right word. Certainly, that the Labour saw him as a serious politician. He was the one that Labour didn't want to win the Tory leadership contest. And they didn't really mind Robert Jenrick winning, or Kemi Badenoch, because I think Labour thinks that Kemi Badenoch will get into a fight in a phone box and that she won't end this drama kind of atmosphere around the Tory party. But the Tories and the Conservative Party, they seem to believe that Kemi Badenoch will absolutely batter Keir Starmer every Wednesday at noon at PMQs. And I think that's where they see it. So just with those two parties, I suppose that's just a vignette in those. And maybe look on the Liberal Democrats, who've had their best result ever. Spent a bit of time with Ed Davey. I sat on a lakeside up in the Cotswolds and watched him being pulled around by a speedboat in an inflatable,
Oh,
something
you
or
were there
other.
for that, were you?
Well, he did that pretty much every day, Barry. And this was how he spent the election campaigning. No, but look, I'll shut up now and leave time for questions.
No,
But
look, it's absolutely brilliant. But you're right. I've been indulging myself, and there's a couple of questions after coming in, which we should probably turn to. But I certainly I could see about Kemi and the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's questions on a Wednesday. That could be real ding dong stuff. I'm going to turn to Paul Gillespie. How are you, Paul? Good to have you. So Paul, formerly of your parish in the Irish Times, and still a correspondent, and also at UCD, active member of the Institute here. Paul asks, how much focus do Labour have on constitutional futures, preserving the Union, placating Scotland, which you mentioned briefly, but would be good to hear more on, and tackling regional inequalities? Do Labour have the financial capacity to deliver the transactional resources and politics needed for that? Any thoughts?
well, just in terms of the focus on the regions, one of Sue Gray's successes before she was unceremoniously chucked out was that she had built up a really good relationship between Labour HQ and the devolved regions, like Andy Burnham in Manchester, the devolved governments. And Labour really saw the system of devolution as being this system of pipes that they could get a lot of pour resources down and get a lot of stuff done really, really quickly. And it was kind of Sue Gray's achievement was to improve relations between all of the devolved leaders and Keir Starmer and HQ, which had been kind of sketchy until she came along. So, sorry, I forget all of Paul's question, but just yeah, I know he mentioned Scotland in it. Scotland has been a relentless focus of Labour's politically. It turns out they didn't need the Scottish votes in the end, the Scottish seats in the end to win a majority. Their numbers were so high anyway. But there is. They never shut up talking about it, basically, in Westminster. And there's a relentless focus on bringing Anna Sarwar, who was the Scottish Labour leader, into the centre of the conversation at any point. I mean, in Rachel Reeves' budget, she gave an extra, I think it was £3.4 billion under the Barnett formula to Scotland to spend on its public services. Actually, Scotland announced their draft budget yesterday, actually. So they have poured resources at Scotland in that sense. And they would like. I think Labour is looking ahead to the Holyrood elections in 2026 when they would like to topple the SNP and take control of Labour haven't been in government in Scotland since or certainly not on their own since before 2007. So they really think that they're due a turn up there. And yes, I think yes, they're certainly going to direct resources at Scotland. They've already given that initial 3.4 billion pounds. They have, you know, for example, GB Energy, which is one of their big wheezes, they base that in Aberdeen. Although where else would you base it? I guess only on the North Sea. So Scotland is a big focus there. Wales is a slightly different one, in terms of the regions. There's been another change of First Minister there. Ellen Morgan is in there now. Mark Drakeford has gone, and there was a period of tumult between Mark Drakeford and Ellen Morgan. So there was a lot of political upheaval. Um, I don't think this Labour government is as prepared or as planned for what to do in Wales as it is in Scotland. I mean, from a Westminster perspective, do you know what I mean? I mean, obviously, Wales has had a Labour government for 25, 26 years, since the dawn of devolution. But at a Westminster level, there's a much greater Labour focus on Scotland than there is on Wales. Then on the other devolved regions in England, the metropolitan areas, Manchester and Liverpool and whatever. Yes, I think they are going to give those areas resources for stuff like buses. I mean, a lot of these areas have money now. They're sort of they're bringing a lot of their bus systems back into city control, and there's going to be funds for that. So look, devolution is a system that Labour sees as a convenient distribution network for resources, a much more efficient distribution network, a kind of a decentralization of financial power almost in a sense. And we saw the signals of that in the budget when Rachel Reeves set out the extra money that she was going to give to Scotland under the Barnett formula.
And actually, I might stay with that for a little bit. I propose with the time we have remaining, Mark, I'll put a couple of thoughts to you that are of a domestic nature, domestic pertaining to the UK, and then predictably with the audience we have here at the Institute, there's a couple of questions regarding foreign policy in the UK as well as the rest of the world. But I have a tab open somewhere on my computer here. It's a House of Commons library paper on why are all the local authorities going broke, or why are all the local authorities going bankrupt, I think it's called, which is a very kind of blunt title for what is a usually staid enough kind of producer of very good research and reports. Do you follow that to any extent? Why, large local authorities are running bankrupt?
Like being an election year, most of my focus has been on Westminster. But yeah, I mean, look, obviously there's a trend. I mean, Birmingham, I think, was the most notorious one. A lot of these local authorities, some of them they can issue their own bonds to a certain extent. They do have some certain revenue raising capacities, and look, there just hasn't been great control and oversight from a Westminster perspective of those. So look. I suppose it raises an interesting question that if a lot of these local authorities, and particularly in metropolitan areas like Birmingham and so on, if the actual local authorities, Labour-run local authorities, haven't managed their finances so well, why pour extra resources into devolution in these areas? Have they shown that they can't spend the money so wisely? Look, I don't know. Time will tell on that. But yeah, no, it is interesting that this phenomenon. The Tories try and paint it that it's just Labour councils that are going bust. I don't think that's entirely true. I
I
think
don't
some
think
of
it's
the
entirely
ones.
true, you know.
I think some of the ones that were Tory controlled have also gotten into problems. But outside of London, which has its own economy, obviously, and in the Midlands and the Northeast and other areas, I mean, the economy in a lot of these areas is really moribund. I mean, there really are no or few avenues for growth. This is something again that the Labour government is going to have to focus on over the next while. Is driving growth and not just abstract growth, but growth that people feel in their pockets and that they feel in their standard of living. I think a lesson that this Labour government, by the way, has learned from the Biden campaign, the failed Biden campaign in the US, is that it's no good being the fastest growing economy and telling people that if they don't feel better off, it doesn't matter what a GDP figures are abstract. These people don't care about GDP. What they care about is their own pockets, and particularly outside of London, and where people's pockets have felt like they've had holes in them for years.
That's one of the iron laws of politics, I think, isn't it? The James Carville thing about it being the economy. Staying within the borders of the UK, there's a question from Emma Richardson, who's a researcher here at the Institute. Hello, Emma. Emma asks, as I think a lot of people, including myself, are wondering if you have anything to say on, how do you think Northern Ireland features in the broader context of British politics today, both in terms of public opinion across Britain and its influence on key national issues such as governance, Brexit, and Labour's overall vision for the Union? I'll just give a tiny kind of addition to that. I remember working in and out of Westminster and London for a long time, and I'll be the first person to kind of speak up for life in the UK. I had a great time there, and lots of great people with interest in Ireland. But the number of times I was stopped in my tracks, stunned by some kind of astounding level of ignorance that someone who ought to know better about the constitutional nature of these islands happened more than a couple of times. So I'm always very interested to consider Emma's question there. What role do you think Northern Ireland today is playing in kind of the political moment in the UK, but also more generally, given your travels across the country?
Not a lot, to be honest. I mean, look, Keir Starmer has done quite a good job of resetting relations with the Republic, with Ireland, and with smoothing things over in the north. Look, he understands Northern Ireland. I mean, he worked there for, I think about 5 years as a human rights advisor to when they were setting up the PSNI. So he understands the dynamics there. But I think for the ordinary British or English voter and political system generally, there's not a lot of interest in Northern Ireland at the moment. There was only interest in insofar as it was a part of the Brexit debate. I remember, I think it was earlier this year, sitting down having a cup of tea with John Alderdice, who was over in Westminster. Obviously, he's a member of the House of Lords, and he told me that as far as he was concerned, the emotional connection between British people and specifically English people and Northern Ireland was completely absent. He thought it was completely broken. He thought that there was no. He said that in his estimation that most English people couldn't give a hoot if Northern Ireland sailed off into the sunset tomorrow. Now, obviously, it's different at a political level. Keir Starmer understands that. I think when Northern Ireland isn't in the news. I think in Westminster they don't really think about it at all, and I think that's probably the best way to look at it. And just going back to something in Paul Gillespie's question, I think he mentioned as well, the constitutional position. I mean, I know that Gordon Brown obviously had before the election drafted this big plan for how to use devolution and devolution max and how to absolutely maximize devolution on the constitutional issue with Northern Ireland. One thing that I've noticed is that Keir Starmer has changed his tune between what he said before the election and what he says now. Before the election, Keir Starmer made a point of specifically saying that he would campaign, if there was a referendum for United Ireland, that he would campaign for it to remain in the Union, that he saw himself as a unionist. That was a political gambit, I think, because for two reasons. Number one, he was afraid that if he looked weak on the Union in terms of Northern Ireland, that he'd be torn apart by the SNP in Scotland. Um, um, and number two, he was trying to appeal to all of these Brexity voters, these kind of white van man up in Sunderland and in the northeast of England who had actually voted for Boris Johnson's Tory party in 2019, and they were trying to tempt all these guys back. I mean, if you notice, for example, during the election campaign, for example, the St. George's flag for England was everywhere, all over Labour's campaign. The Union Jack was everywhere. And there was a time, maybe under Jeremy Corbyn, when the Union Jack and specifically the St. George's flag, I mean, it would have been like, for a lot of Corbynites, it would have been like hanging a Nazi symbol at a party rally. They ran a million miles through it. Labour embraced all of that. They embraced Englishness. They embraced the St. George's flag. They embraced the Union Jack. And in the midst of all of that, Keir Starmer embraced a kind of a pro-union position on Northern Ireland that was really very careful and conservative, and it was all about not opening himself up to criticism. Since he's become Prime Minister, I think he's been a little bit more nuanced on that. I think he understands the concerns of nationalists and of Republicans. He's quite well disposed to them. He doesn't talk now about. He doesn't certainly doesn't make any play about how much of a unionist he is and how much he would campaign for Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK if there was a referendum. And that's I just noticed that there's a subtle difference on that in terms of Northern Ireland, the sort of pre-election Keir Starmer and the post-election Keir Starmer.
That's really interesting as ever, Mark. Just before turning to maybe a final volley of questions about foreign policy, is there anything about the current clutch of Northern Irish MPs, the ones who show up? Do they have much of a profile, or are any of them kind of turning your head in any way?
Of the Northern Ireland MPs, I mean, look, I suppose you could say Jim Allister, and Jim Allister has a private members bill, it's related to the Brexit deal and so on. I think that's actually being debated today, no, tomorrow, I think, and tomorrow's Friday, right? I think that's actually due to be debated in Parliament tomorrow. He's the first private members bill on the list was last week's assisted dying one. The second one is Jim Allister's bill. Now, look, I think he's a little bit worried about whether or not anyone will show up for it. I think it would be a bit much to say Jim Allister has stood out. I remember during the when the new speaker was being sworn in, I remember sitting in the House of Commons when it's traditional for all the leaders of all the parties to stand up and say something, and you're supposed to say something nice and friendly, and basically, and as the leader of the TUV, Jim Allister stood up and said something really divisive and not very gracious, and there was this groan around the House of Commons, and I thought, God, this guy's going to slip off into the ditch now, and no one's going to want to hear from him. But he's actually been quite active about the place, and he's actually hired as an advisor a guy called Gawain Towler, who used to work for Nigel Farage until he was sacked a couple of weeks ago by the new chairperson of the Reform Party. So that there's been a bit of mending of fences. Anyway, that's an aside, but there's been a mending of fences between the TUV
Oh, of
and
course, yeah, of
Reform
course.
and Reform. Other ones that have stood out. I think it'll be interesting to see what Colm Eastwood does now that he is no longer the leader of the SDLP and he doesn't have the burden of running the party. I think he was quite satisfied to hand over the leadership of the SDLP to Claire Hanna and go back to being a constituency MP. He's an interesting voice. He's very, very articulate, Colm Eastwood. And whenever he makes speeches, people tend to listen because he's such a good deliverer of a speech. When in such contrast to Jim Allister, when the speaker was being elected, at the start of the new parliament, and Jim Allister made that speech that went down like a lead balloon. Colm Eastwood made one of the funniest speeches I've ever heard in the House of Commons. So it'll be interesting to see how he gets on without the burden of leadership of
Very
the party.
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, they're two objectively very talented politicians, the two people you just mentioned, and there's a track record of not just SDLP MPs, but certainly SDLP MPs having an outsized role in Westminster and being. I think even Mark Durkan won the kind of the humorous MP award a couple of times, whatever it's called. They're kind of good for those sorts of set pieces. Let's
Yeah.
move to maybe the final piece, Mark, that there's a question I'll put to you. It's from an attendee. It's rather specific, and I'll maybe add a slightly more general question to it, and then it'll give you the chance to, if you have anything to say about these questions, great. And then just to wrap up, any final thoughts you have. We've obviously only scratched the surface. There's loads of things you could have mentioned and rabbit holes you could have fallen down. So thanks a million for covering such a wide variety of things. Liam Roach asks, how are you, Liam? Good to have you here. Is it likely that the often heralded veterinary agreement between the UK and the EU will actually happen? It seems this may be the extent of Labour's ambition for relations with the EU, and even this may not happen. And just in addition to that, Mark, if you've anything to say that hasn't been said yet about Labour's relations with the European Union 5 years on from the UK's departure, and indeed with the US maybe since the um, recent election there, just Labour's place in the world and how it views itself in terms of its foreign policy. Any thoughts?
Well, look, if Labour wants a veterinary agreement, it's going to have to give something in return, right? And they still haven't really showed their hands about what they're willing to give in return. And I think when you talk to a lot of European Union ambassadors in London, there is almost universal consternation amongst them about what does this Labour government have against Erasmus, right? You know, the student scheme. And what I think if Labour wants a veterinary agreement, it's going to have to give something on that. And it's going to have to include some sort of, the Europeans want an Erasmus, some sort of a scheme for their young people to come to London, come to anywhere in Britain, but principally London, and spend a bit of time here and have British students go abroad. They want a replacement for Erasmus. They want some sort of a young person scheme, and Labour are absolutely terrified of it. And I actually asked Jonathan Ashworth about this on Monday. I think it was Monday when we sat down, and he said, "Look, there is a fear in Labour of saying or doing anything that looks like we're rowing back on our pledge that freedom of movement would never come back." So to answer Liam's question, do I think they'll get it? I think eventually they will get something from in terms of a phytosanitary agreement from the European Union, but I think they're going to have to give something on Erasmus and on student free movement of students, and 1 year visas for students, work study stuff. They're going to have to give something on that. Just as a wider general point then, in relation to the EU, I don't think they've made really that great of a fist yet of resetting relations with the European Union. They've talked a lot, but they haven't showed their hand yet on what they're prepared to offer. I mean, I know in addition to a veterinary agreement, what they really would like is some sort of an agreement that benefits the City of London as well. And I know Rachel Reeves is under a lot of pressure from people in the City of London to get some sort of a deal there, around mutual recognition of qualifications, and just a deal to benefit the city. And again, Labour are going to have to hitch their skirt a little bit there and show a little bit of ankle about what they're prepared to offer the European Union in return. And so far they haven't done that. And I think that's led to a little bit of frustration amongst EU ambassadors in London that, if Labour keeps saying it wants a better relationship with Europe, it keeps saying that, it wants economic growth, and that, we can help with economic growth, but they won't tell us what they're going to give us in return. And that might be something that Keir Starmer, and I think David Lammy as well, turned their attention to. A complicating factor, of course, in all of that, and it's a very big complicating factor, in the shape of Donald Trump in the United States. I think they're going to wait and see how relations pair out first between themselves and the US before they really get their teeth into the European relationship. Britain has always, I think, and again, this is something that Jonathan Ashworth mentioned on Monday, Britain has always viewed itself, at least, whether it's viewed externally or not like this, I don't know, but it's viewed itself as a kind of a bridge between Washington and Europe, a kind of a translator, a political translator. And I think they really covet taking up that role again. They've put a lot of effort. David Lammy in particular has put a lot of effort into the US and trying to have good relations there, and they think they've cracked it. They think they've got good relations with the Trump administration, and through that maybe that will refract into the relationship with Europe, I think.
Mark, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I can only hope we can continue the conversations next time you're back in Dublin, or online again. But it's been really marvelous exposition of a whole lot of politics in a relatively short space of time, politics and other things indeed. So thanks a million for your time. Keep up the good work and the corresponding. And indeed, thanks to those at home as well who joined, and indeed those who are listening after the fact. Many thanks also to Emma Richardson and my team for pulling things together, and Rocca Malali for doing the tech. Mark, thanks a million, and we'll see you next time.
No, thanks, Barry.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.